I was halfway to my car before I knew it, a fresh cup of coffee in my hand. Ellie wouldn't let me leave without one. I set the cup of coffee down on the roof of the Dodge and started digging around in my pockets looking for keys. A scream ripped out of the restaurant behind me. It was long and loud. Sounded like someone stuck their hand in a deep fat fryer. Or had it forced into one. It startled me and I jumped, so much so that I dropped my keys. I heard a snort, which sounded suspiciously like it was at my expense. I looked over my shoulder and bent over to grab my keys. Murray's horse, Pistola, was tied up in the parking lot, about 3 spaces down from me. It was technically against the city ordinance to tie up an animal in a commercial parking lot, outside of rodeo season, of course. And there was a special emphasis on undead animals. But I won't tell if you won't. The skeletal equine was staring over at me, feed bag strapped to its face. I pretended not to notice that the feed bag was stained brown, with the suspicious black liquid dripping out of the stained burlap. Sometimes in Bull's heart, the answers just aren't worth the questions. Cut me some slack, dude, I said. My voice may or may not have registered a bit of annoyance. I'm not a 300-year-old dead horse. Shit creeps me out sometimes. I could have sworn that old Pistola rolled his eyes at that, but I may just be giving the horse too much credit. I heard another scream erupt from the diner, this one ending suddenly. The context clues I had at my disposal told me that Marcel was the one doing the screaming in there. Now, were I a normal sheriff's deputy, it would have been my job to run into that diner and ready to get to the bottom of it. But I already knew the score and felt no need to investigate further. Plus, fuck that guy. Stripers had no protections under the law, and I was specifically instructed to ensure their safety at my discretion, and I discretified that Marcel was a worthless piece of human wreckage, who should be fed into a wood chipper. His death would truly be a net benefit to humanity as a whole, and that was about as far as I was willing to take it. Just as I scooped up my keys, I heard a low, nervous sound from the undead horse. One of those, "Hey, I'm not cool with this," sounds a horse makes. The rustle of feathers creeping out of the night sky, and the horse's call of unease was only an accompaniment. Fuck, I swore out loud. A rustle of feathers in the night breeze could only mean a few things in Bull's heart, and only one of them would creep out a horse. I stood up straight looking for it, resting my paw on the handle of my smoke wagon, my fingers wrapping around the checkered grip of the ridiculously large revolver. There was always the stink of blood in the air. They could bring the cold with them too. As I was arrested by the shiver running down my spine and the light stream I was suddenly exhaling, the hairs on my bare arm stood up in response to the suddenly frigid air. On one level, I knew I was under no immediate threat, but you tell that to 200,000 years of evolutionary preservational instincts. Shit was there for a reason. I suppose you could say the thing perched over the door of Earl's Diner made me uncomfortable. Just a touch. The neon light from the diner cast an odd neon red hue across it. The light seemed to articulate the shadows it lurked in, but I wouldn't have even had looked at the damn thing to know it was watching me. The whole sight of the thing was like watching a demon stalk you. Nobody was really sure where they had come from. Nobody who'd been to the great beyond or any such ports of mystical or metaphysical call could recall any creature in any of their travels. I would describe it as humanoid, with big, rugged vulture's wings, a bipedal body, bird's leg, a man chest. I usually saw a big fuck-off beak that was attached to the face that looked similar to a plague doctor's mask. Rarely did two people ever see the same thing when they looked at the creatures. Well, for the most part. The going theory is that there's some matter of shapeshifter, but that still left a lot to explain. Everybody described the same ragged wings and the same piercing eyes. Orbs of pure white that burned with a mix of corruption and malevolent anger, like the spotlights of hate on a greasy black night. But nobody could agree on the secondary characteristics. To me, they all looked the same. But if I tried to describe what I saw, you wouldn't really know what I was talking about. Because you saw a horse's head with the seagull's beak for a face or other such silliness. This particular creature's wings were drooped over it like a cloak. I could see the eyes boring into me from the inky black recesses of its wings. No notion of a head or shoulders or anything that could be discerned from the shadows. I glared back at it for a moment before I took a Weaver shooting style position. I drew out my smoke wagon and planted its front sight smack dab between those dumbass eyes. It did nothing but glare back at me with those huge hate-filled peepers. I couldn't tell if it understood what was happening, but I could make out its inky black talons flexing on the perch, as if it were about to throw itself at me and rip my belly open in a vat of avian fury. Everything in me wanted to pull the trigger on my Magnum Research BFR and send a 45-70 government-concentrated exploding sabot round right into the thing's forehead. Everything in me wanted to send that unearthly thing back to whatever soulless void it spawned from. These things aren't right for this world, and everything in me was telling me to send it back where it belonged, to the pit it crawled out of. But technically, under Texas Department of Fish and Game Code, they're classified as an endangered species. So all I could do was whisper, "Bang," like a petulant child, and reluctantly holster my weapon. I am not horribly mature, I'll admit. Yeah, sure, they stole dead bodies. Sure, they flew around from dusk till dawn creeping the living fuck out of people. Sure, they had all the sentience of a learning disabled possum, but some genius decided to call them an endangered species and grant them protected habitats, like the forest surrounding Bull's Heart. Because where the fuck else would they go? The thrice cursed things are illegal to hunt for sport or harvest, and if you kill one by accident, boy, you better have your ducks in a row because you're going to be investigated for poaching, which in Texas means you're going to be facing a lot of jail time. Some fucking liberal bullshit, if you ask me. Our local game warden, a fella named Lingasu, was very particular about the animals in what he calls his forest. He had zero problems running in deputies for violating Texas Fish and Game Code. He once arrested a deputy named Landis for taking one down, even though he had a good reason for it. Well, maybe not a good reason, but a pretty damn good excuse. About once a month or so, Deputy Landis has a condition that, we'll just say it's best to get him away from people for a couple of days or so. He goes a little bit wild in that time frame, so he goes out to a plot of land he owns out in the woods and just rides it out. It's safer for everybody that way. During one of these fits, I guess you could call it, he took down one of those creatures and ate about half of it. Warden Langasu took him in for it. It didn't matter that Deputy Langus wasn't in the right frame of mind. He still didn't have a population control hunting license, which was the only way to legally hunt them. Sheriff Onru had gone to bat for the deputy, going so far as to cite the Americans with Disability Act of 1990, trying to point out that Deputy Landis had a condition and certain accessions had to be made in order to provide a fair and equal environment for him, including free-rein hunting rights for the thing that lived inside him. Langasu wasn't buying it, though. "Laws be laws," the game warden said, "and in my forest and my jurisdiction, the laws be respected." Sanctimonious do-gooder prick. But the creatures did a good job of keeping their numbers low, and they really didn't go out of their way to attack people, unless cornered. Which is a good thing, because when they got worked up into a lather, they can dish out a lot of punishment before they finally go down. Kinda like a skyborn armadillo, only a hell of a lot less cute. This specimen, as if sensing my unease, leaned forward and screeched at me. I got the impression of a beak sticking out between its legs. The scream was a loud, frigid silence. It gave off the audio sensation of nails on a chalkboard, mixed with a crying newborn. A pretty unpleasant mix of audio input, to say the least. Then the burning eyes turned back to Pistola, and I briefly wondered if the creature was going to go after the undead horse. I mean, they were Death Eaters, and technically the horse was dead after a fashion. I would legally be allowed to shoot it at that point, as Pistola was technically livestock. Dead stock? Anyway, in Bull's Heart you could defend tamed animals from wild ones, especially with all the weird crap that lives out in our woods. But before I could sink too much thought into it, the creature reared its haunches and gave one last terrifying screech and took wing, disappearing quickly into the night sky. My caveman ego wanted to believe that it was because the creature was made uncomfortable by my presence. But, more than likely, it probably figured that the staff of Toothy Earls was going to toss Marcel's corpse out the front door, so there was no point in hanging around. Either way, Pistola seemed pretty okay with the end results. He let out a sigh of equine relief as the potential predator made his exit. I watched the night sky in the direction it flew off for a moment, wondering if it was going to change its mind and come back. They have a name. Like, we don't just call them creatures. I just happen to think the name is stupid. Real fucking stupid. Because it's not a hot chick on a winged horse swinging a sword. It is in no way, shape, or form a Valkyrie. And yes, that is a hill I am absolutely willing to die on. It's a fucking bird monster, not a chick who escorts dead warriors to the Allfather's table. Can't put that shit on the side of a panel van from the 70s. End of discussion. I just call them shitbirds. When I was certain that the shitbird was gone for good, I turned and gave Pistola a nod. "You're safe now, sir," I said with a professional smile. "You're welcome." The horse just stared back at me with milky dead eyes. He seemed very unimpressed. "Fine," I said, feigning a bit of exasperation. "Act like that thing didn't scare the shit out of your peanut-sized mind." The horse snorted at me again, and I swear he managed to roll his pupilless white eyes at me. That damn horse was smarter than he was letting on. I shook my head and turned back to the Charger, but as I got into the Dodge, I thought I heard something. Like words floating out of the dark. Scratchy, raspy, just at the point of it being audible. The point where you aren't sure if your inner monologue or your ears. And I definitely wasn't quite sure which one it was. "The master comes." I stared off in the direction the creature had flown. Well, that was odd, and I couldn't be quite sure that I heard it. But I couldn't completely write it off either. I knew the way to the Miller's house like the back of my hand. We were out there enough after all. The Millers were two people who never should have been together, but they were both also extremely stubborn. Neither one was going to be the first one to broke and leave. They also refused to admit they had problems, even when they were doing their best to rip each other apart. It made conflict mediation between the two parties a royal bitch. They were one of the reasons I hated this godforsaken town. I'm going to meet up with Gruck and Dallowale at the foot of the Miller's driveway, and we would go up to their property as a group. It's usually best to go on calls with as much backup as possible, especially in this town. I briefly thought about Gruck's condition. I glanced down toward the digital defense control suite sitting in the middle of my patroller center console. The screen showed that the UV defensive lighting rig that sat on the roof of the up-armored Charger Hellcat cruiser was turned off. I reached down and tapped the off button just to be sure. Then I reached over to hit the manual safety, locking it out of action. A lot of citizens in Bullhearts had one condition or another that made UV light everything from annoying to downright lethal. So much so that the local government classified UV lights as a destructive device. If you had some, you'd better have a very damn good reason for having them, or you were going to go to jail. Occasionally, certain people would kick up a stink about it, make some noise about it being a violation of their Second Amendment, but they usually don't get much support because, well, it's hard to get people real worked up about a light bulb. It would have been a damn shame to take Gruck and possibly Dallowale out of action, due to some avoidable ass-hatted dipshittery. I actually wasn't sure if UV would take out Dallowale or not, but I did know that his kind were nocturnal. So, better safe than sorry. I turned down the dirt road that would take me to the Miller's front gate. Something about the way my cruiser's headlights played down the narrow tree-lined dirt road had an ominous feeling. I really hoped that it wasn't a sign of things to come. Here the fuck we go, I mumbled to myself. I saw Gruck's SUV and Dallowale's cruiser parked next to the Miller's cattle gate. Gruck had to drive one of the bigger SUVs due to her massive size. More like her massive ass, I said to myself, giving myself a slight chuckle in response, finding myself absolutely hilarious. And before you ask, yes, I'm aware that I'm an idiot. I parked behind the big SUV and got out, but not before I let dispatch know where I was. "Jen, Whiskey Hotel 10-3 at the Miller's," I told dispatch over the radio.
"Roger that, Whiskey Hotel. Good luck."
"Roger, thanks." Dallowale and Gruck were standing in front of the latter's cruiser, looking up at the property. Gruck turned her massive head my way. The black pupils of her eyes seemed to dig right through me as she stared. Her lips parted slightly and she gave me a disdainful sneer. "Oh, look," she said, sounding gruff and vaguely British, like a bad guy from a Lord of the Rings movie. "I sent a pathetic little Omi to back us up." Her face looked like it could have froze fire. She looked like she wanted to rip my belly open and play with what she found inside there. She squared up her shoulders like she was ready to throw down, and raised her hands up to about shoulder height, flexing every muscle in her upper body. Her jaw fell open, revealing some seriously nasty gleaming white canines. A threat display if there ever was one. Her body armor and duty belt did nothing except add to the idea that she was prepped and ready for a real slobber knocker. She took a step forward, looking every bit of the bruiser that she really was. From the top of her ponytail to the soles of her size 20 black Bates combat boots. She was built for war. Literally. That's what her race was bred for. Only thing Omis are good for is filling bellies. Dallowale looked at her with a "what the fuck" look on his face. He genuinely seemed surprised by her words and aggressive actions. He looked over to me, his big yellow eyes growing wide. He raised his hand to a beard and stroked it a few times, looking back and forth between us. I got the feeling that this was how his nerves showed themselves. The palm of his hand faced outwards and his fingers seemed to go backwards like their joints were reversed. He was a transfer from another town like Bull's Heart, somewhere in Florida. Thunder? Maybe it was Cougar Teeth. Not that it mattered, I guess. He'd only been with the sheriff's department a few weeks now, and he had been through most of his training time. He may have been a veteran, but here in Texas, he was the new guy. He was still trying to figure out what was what. The look on his face said he wasn't quite sure what he found himself in the middle of here, but he really didn't like it. I wasn't used to backwards hand thingy yet, but it was still a little weird for me. The tiger head was a little off-putting too, but that was easier to get used to. He seemed like a hell of a nice guy though so far. Like, he was really working hard to dispel all the negative views people had towards free-form shapeshifters. He really didn't need to though. He wouldn't have earned his star if he was an asshole. I tried to come up with a witty zinger to shoot back at Gruck, but I was drawing a blank. I almost went with Old Reliable, a Shrek reference. But I just wasn't feeling it. So I raised my hand to my waist, making sure not to spill my coffee, mugged a sarcastically terrified expression at her. "Ooh, scary," I said in the most mockingly insincere voice I could muster, rolling my eyes as hard as I could. "Cut the fucking shit, Gruck, you're scaring the new guy." "Would you watch your language?" Gruck said suddenly, dropping the bad movie orc accent like a habit. Her real voice sounded like a housewife from somewhere in the Midwest. Like Nebraska or some shit. Flat, but somehow bubbly. You always had the suspicion that the next word out of her mouth was going to be, "Ope." And besides, he wasn't scared, he already knows I'm a total sweetie, she said, fixating at him with a wide smile, which, despite the fact that it showed off her massive fanged canines, still managed to come off incredibly warm and inviting, like somebody's mom. I gave him some of my famous oatmeal cookies. Would a big, nasty, evil orc make oatmeal cookies for the new guy? She directed the last question at Dallowale. He looked somewhat shocked at the rapid shift in tones. His eyes were wide and his jaw still kinda hung open. I could tell that he wasn't exactly sure if we were playing a game of fuck with the new guy. He shifted his gaze between our faces. He swallowed a bit nervously. Well. His voice had a crisp English accent that a lot of the educated Indian immigrants had when they learned their English from a British-founded university. You could tell from his tone that he wasn't super comfortable with the situation. The cookies. I got the feeling that he had to mentally restrain himself from saying biscuits. Did have raisins in them, so the question of being a sweetie is something of a malicious sort isn't really been settled just yet. It took me a second, but I finally got the humor. Fucker was so goddamn dry in his delivery that it almost didn't land. I gave him a chuckle. I got the notion that he was going to be an okay guy to work with. Once he got settled in, that is. Gruck, however, stared at him for a moment. She didn't give him a laugh, but she gave him another award-winning smile. She placed her left fist on her waist and pointed at him with the other hand. "I'm going to keep my eye on you, mister," she said with a bit of humor in her voice. "And don't worry about the raisins. It's just my way of messing with the new guy. But don't worry. They help the body increase blood production. That's good for you. And me." Dallowale waited a beat before giving Grug a wide-eyed nervous chuckle, before breaking contact and looking down to make sure his boots were still on his feet. His timid response set me off. I let loose with a stifled laugh. I squeezed my eyes shut and laughed into the back of my hand, my side shaking. Now, Dallowale wasn't a small guy. He was broad across the shoulders. He had fangs and claws and his own gun too. I didn't know him too well, but I would bet that he could take care of himself in a fight. His kind were usually pretty good with their mitts. Or at least that's what I've heard about them. That might just be a stereotype, though. If it is, and anyone out there reading this are one of the Rakshasa people and have a problem with it, please know that I didn't mean anything by it. But when a person of Gruck's size and ability, friendly disposition or not, makes some kind of mention about your platelet count, it could be a little disconcerting. Especially since Gruck, in addition to being one of the largest specimen of orc you could ever meet, was also afflicted with vampirism. She was hell on wheels without the condition. Half the department called her Mama Bear, because if you were down and bleeding and you needed somebody to drag your ass out of a fire, she was the one you would want arriving on the scene. Believe me, I know what it's like to be laying on your back, getting the shit kicked out of you, and looking up to see Gruck come charging onto the scene, like a cross between the Incredible Hulk and Jesus Christ. But as to how she came across vampirism, it's actually kind of a sweet story. A few years back, she fell for a local gal named Maddie, and they got married. Maddie was a vampire. In good standing, of course. But then again, she had to be, because rogue vampires would get run out of town pretty quick, if not staked down for the morning sun. A man by the name of Kincaid ran the local vampire coven, and he was a stickler for the rules of fair conduct, which the United Nightwalkers Covens and Clans of the United States, Mexico, and Canada applied to towns like Bullsheart. Kincaid ran a tight ship, and the sheriff's department had rarely ever had a reason to fight with the bloodsuckers. Well, except that one time. But that's neither here nor there. Plus, we don't talk about it around here. It would be especially impolite to discuss it with outsiders. Anyway, the point is that the vampirism extenuating her already considerable strength and hardiness, she had gone from hell on wheels to a one-woman seal company. Part of the lovely couple's wedding vows had been that Maddie converting Gruck into a vampire. Maddie had taken Gruck's name and Gruck had taken on Maddie's condition. I had to admit it twanged on the dusty heartstrings. For some reason, it just struck me as beautiful. Not to tell somebody that you want to be with them forever, but to actually take steps in doing so, well, I'm not gonna lie. I shed a few happy tears at that wedding. I guess I'm just a bit of a softie. Senior Deputy Gruck, I said, doing my best to come to Dollar Whale's rescue. If you could quit subtly terrifying the new guy for a moment, I think we have a wellness visit to make. If you'd like to take charge and lead your valiant warriors on a crusade in the name of public safety, now'd be a good time for that. Oh, you party pooper, Gruck said. She drew up to her full height and turned to look at the Miller's house. It was a ranch style sitting on top of a slight hill. The lights were off and nobody appeared to be home. Okay, she said, looking down at me. First things first, cowboy. She pointed at the Magnum Research BFR in my holster. Go to your car and get a gun that isn't stupid. God damn it, I grumbled. 5 minutes later, we were walking up the Miller's driveway, a 5th generation Glock 40 sitting in my holster. We had to hoof it up to the property, because the cattle gate across the driveway was locked, not that it would have mattered. Because once a car crossed the Miller's gate, it tended to experience engine trouble, never getting more than 20 feet before shutting down completely. Radios had issues too. Hell, the 3D RMR sight on my pistol was probably dead. Like it's a 10-year battery just burnt out. It was something to do with the nature of the Millers and the magic they threw around. Electronics just hated it for some reason. So normally we just left anything with a battery in the car. I was staring up at the house as I walked. It was odd. Usually at this point we could hear them screaming at each other, then a pop and fizzle of magic spells going off. Inhuman roaring as demons were summoned, not to attack but to help bolster arguments. Dishes breaking. Tonight, though, it was different. Dead silence, like the house was a tomb. My eyes were going from window to window looking for any sign of life and finding none. No fluttering curtains, no lights popping on and off. Nothing. Just the crunch of our boots on old asphalt. I almost didn't notice the temperature drop until I exhaled steam. I shivered inside my uniform. I was just about to ask where the fuck that came from when Dollar Whale spoke up. We're being watched, he said quietly. I see them too, Gruck said. All the merriment gone from her voice. She was switched on now, jokes and unprofessionalism gone. She eased the AR pistol she carried from her belt. It was chambered in 458 SOCOM, and of course the entire lower was custom made to fit her gigantic hand, including a grip that was more like a 1911 pistol rather than a traditional AR group, making it the next best thing to a bolter. I count 12 in the trees on the west side of the clearing. I count 8 down my side, Dollawale replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. I can't see shit, I said, wishing I had some form of natural night vision, like my creature of the night comrades. Valkyrie, was all Gruck said. Shit, I muttered. Language, Gruck gently admonished, without taking her eyes off the trees and the edges of the clearing. I followed her gaze out to the trees. I could just barely make out little pinpoints of white light that would have been the eyes of the shitbirds. I whistled lowly. There were a bunch of them out there. I'd never seen so many in one place. Usually there's no more than 2 or 3 in one spot, and they would fight each other. It looks like these assholes were just copping a squat and having a watch. Very odd behavior for shitbirds. I've never seen so many, Dollawale said, a tremor of discomfort in his voice. I noticed his tail was held down, close to his leg. This might have been a good tactical decision, or it might have been an involuntary fear-based response. Don't let him get to you, Gruck said, her voice soaked in matronly concern. They never come for us, just for the dead. Yeah, I said, turning my attention to the house. Boss lady's right, pay him no mind. I took a sip from my coffee cup I was still holding. I was intentionally trying to look as nonchalant as possible, partially for the new guy, and partially for the fact that I wasn't going to give the shitbirds the satisfaction of spooking me twice in one night. I did my best to walk like I didn't have a care in the world. Dollawale looked over his shoulder at me. His eyes widened when he recognized the stylized alligator on the cup, Toothy Earl's logo. You were at Toothy Earl's earlier? He asked me, his ears perking up a bit. Was Miss Ellie working? Yep, I responded. Breaking in a new striper. Didn't go so hot for him. Ah, the new guy said. Do you happen to know if she is, talking to anyone? She talks to a lot of people, I said, playing dumb. It's part of her job, silly boots. Oh, no, he said, looking back to his side of the clearing and the Valkyrie and the trees beyond. I meant, is she in a relationship with anyone? Well, I said, continuing to play dumb in vain. I'm sure she has a lot of relationships with a lot of people. Oh, be nice, Grug grunted at me. You know what he meant, she said to me. Dollawale said, there's a fella she talks to, but I don't know if it's serious. Tall, blonde, human. A lot of people think he might be that one with the lightning, the hammer guy. What's his name? Oh, it doesn't matter. Her voice picked up a little bit of a growl as she went on, apparently remembering what we were supposed to be focusing on, the task at hand. Both of you need to pay attention to your sectors, or I'll treat you like a couple of juice boxes and call out for a couple of dum-dums to back me up, after I've sucked you both dry. Yes, ma'am, Dollawale said, responding to the matronly authority in her voice. Yeah, I said, properly scolded, not even attempting to go for the obvious joke. Sorry, boss. She was right. Now wasn't the time for jawjacking. She had left it unsaid, but there were a lot more shitbirds out here than anyone had ever seen in one spot. They were acting strangely. This is the quietest Miller's Call I've ever been out on. I would wager that it was probably Gruck's quietest too. It was too weird of a night to be acting like a dumbass rookie. There was time to fuck with the new guy, and this wasn't it. Clearly. I followed Gruck's lead and drew my Glock. I checked the RMR dot on it, and noticed that it was, in fact, no longer illuminated on the glass. Like the battery was dead. Fucking Millers and their spooky-ass hoodoo. The rest of the short walk was quiet. I watched the front, where the house was. Gruck and Dollawale watched the sides. They stayed quiet. I would occasionally peek off to the side at the trees in the distance, wide eyes beyond beam back at me, making them look underdressed, sparsely decorated Christmas trees. I kind of wish people were talking more, as the feeling of all those eyes were driving me crazy, like ants skittering up and down my spine. Some light conversation would be great to take my mind off the current events. When we got to the house, Gruck mounted the steps and paused. She looked around. She tilted her head to the side and sniffed the air. She suddenly tensed up. What? I asked her. Blood, she responded. Lots of it. Human. Now, were this the movies, a vampire would look at me like a pot roast and get that strange look in her eye. But this isn't the movies, and Senior Deputy Lavonda Gruck is a goddamn professional, and I'll not have any of you imply otherwise. She treated it like a call for help and instantly got ready to run into the unknown, to a situation and potentially save a life. She raised her massive pistol and trained it on the door. She motioned me with her head, telling me to kick the door in for her. She looked at Delawale and patted herself on the backside, wordlessly telling him to stack up on her. He nodded and did as he was instructed. I leaned against the opposite side of the door, my back against the wall. I raised my leg and swung it back, giving the door a solid donkey kick. The door flew open with an explosion of cheap trim and paint flakes. Gruck and Dallowale flowed into the house, Gruck giving a duck down in the doorway, so she wouldn't bang her head on the jamb. "Sheriff's Department," she yelled. The living room was empty of life. There was a stone table set up where a coffee table would be in a normal living room, with stone bowls and unidentified powders on them. Jars full of God knows what covered the bookshelves that covered the entire wall. Candles lit the space. Some burned all the way down. Looked like they had been going for a while. Strange symbols were painted everywhere. I recognized a couple of them just from being on the job so long, I guess. This looks like a wizard's lab or a witch's brewery. It probably was too, knowing the Millers. "Clear," I heard Dallowale yell. His voice was a bit more of a roar, with the adrenaline surging through his veins. Gruck looked over at me. She pointed her nose and leaned toward the door leading off the living room. She patted her backside again. I got behind her, ready to go wherever she would take me. Gruck always took point. She was the most likely to survive a shotgun blast to the face and stay in the fight, so it was good tactical sense. But it was also just the way she led, from the front. We left Dallowale in the living room to hold our only exit, just in case someone tried to squirt past us. Gruck and I cleared the rest of the house, finding nothing. We came to a stop at a closed door at the end of the main hall. She looked at me and tapped her nose. I got her meaning. This was where the smell was the strongest. I nodded and reached down for the doorknob. I jiggled the handle, finding it unlocked. I shoved it open and in. Gruck went in, pistol at the ready. I flowed in behind her. The smell of tangy copper hit my snout like a bag of hammers. I involuntarily gagged. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black, but I knew it was bad. The room smelled like a badly run slaughterhouse. I felt around for a light switch, found a candelabra instead. Good enough, I thought to myself as I dug in my pocket for a lighter. I gave the Bic a couple of test flicks. "Wait," Grug said from somewhere in the darkness. "It's bad. It's real bad." "Yep," I said and gathered that much from the smell. But how bad can it really be? I lit the candle. It must have been some magic attached to it because the room lit up like a surgery ward. Gruck was right. It was bad. It was real bad. It was a bedroom. You could tell that much from the massive California king-size bed that occupied the center of the room. The comforter was soaked in reddish-brown blood. There was a lump of meat in the center of the bed that I slowly realized was a woman's torso. On the nightstand, there were 10 neatly stacked fingers, severed fingers, in 2 columns of 5 each. On the other nightstand was a head, devoid of a face, just a ragged skull staring at the doorway. At the foot of the bed were 2 crossed legs, like an X. I realized that various organs and bits of bodies were arranged around the torso in a circle. I looked over at Gruck. She stared wide-eyed at the wall above the headboard. I followed her gaze. It was the face of Griselda Miller, staring back at us from the wall, what had been nailed up there like a trophy on display. Eyeless, of course, because the eyes were still in the skull. But I knew that face. It had screamed all matter of venom and curses at me before. There was something weird about this. Well, yeah, no shit, there was something weird, but it was strange, the sort of order where everything was placed in the room. I looked over at Gruck. She looked back at me. I heard her swallow a few times. She wasn't sure what to make of all this. Her face looked almost helpless. I felt bad for the giant orc. She started to speak. Her voice was unsteady. She paused and closed her eyes. "We need to get out of this room," she said with a little more control in her voice. "Yeah," I said, moving toward the door. I had seen this level of carnage before, part of the job. People say when you see shit like this enough, you eventually get used to it. Well, I'm still waiting for that fucking day. "Forensics will have our butts," Gruck said, command firmly back in place, "if we mess something up." "Yeah," I said, not particularly giving a shit why we got out of the room, just happy to do so. We pulled Dallowale out of the house with us. Gruk closing the door behind us, just to preserve the crime scene. We spun him up on what we'd seen, and he narrowed his eyes in thought. What? Gruk asked. Back in Florida, we had a necromancer in town. Ah, fuck, I interrupted with a sigh, knowing exactly where this was going. Necromancers were bastards, and I didn't want to deal with chasing one down. I had one throw a dead cat at me once. It bit me. Shit was weird. Gruk did that handshake shushing things that moms do when you're interrupting one of their shows. She wanted me to put a sock in it. Probably had a problem with the cursing too. What you describe, Dallowale went on to say, sounds like the ritual she did. We never found out why she did it. We figured out who it was and showed up on her doorstep with a lot of firepower. She did not come peacefully. The look on his face and the way he stroked his beard said it was a bad memory. Gruk had an uncomfortable look on her face too. I couldn't say that I blamed her. This could be real bad if somebody's going around killing people for some necromancer bullshit. Well, my week was about to get a whole lot fucking busier. It's always something with this fucking town. Okay, Gruk said. So, let's go down past the gate and see if we can get some backup up here. We're gonna have to wake up the sheriff. She'll be pissed if we don't. But in the meantime, we need to get people looking out for Mark Miller. His whereabouts are unknown, so he's our only suspect at this point. And since the powers that be have a fucking sense of humor, I heard a rustle of wing above our head, right before about 200 pounds of meat was dropped right in the middle of our powwow. It was a body. The legs caught me right in the chest, knocking me on my ass. The face attached to the body's head sure looked a lot like Mark Miller's face, albeit a little more battered and beaten than usual. Dead bodies have a certain look about them, and Mark Miller was rocking the fuck out of that look, broken neck and all. All three of us looked up. The Valkyrie hovered overhead about 20 feet above us. Its wings were wide open, like it was riding in thermal. Its eyes blazed as it glared at us from on high. I had never seen one not sulking in the shadows. I had never seen one this brazen before. "The master comes," it screeched down at us. And that's when all hell decided to break loose. I would like to thank all the amazing patrons currently listed on screen right now for all your support and keeping this channel going. Dan R, Neophyte Games, Chaos X, JY, Pyromancer, Hayden MH, Ethan A, Daniel H, Maximilian Charles P, Go Cute Puppy LLC, Young Sykes, Dark Side of the Bear, Revenick, Paul T, Mr. Swiston, and Sarcastic B. Guys, thank you all so much. It's always appreciated.